Hello and a very warm welcome back to my channel here on YouTube. Now, I would like to talk to you in this video about an interesting case I did last week where I went to meet a couple that live with a Chihuahua. What could possibly go wrong with a Chihuahua, you might think? Because in fairness, I've not seen many Chihuahuas over the years. Obviously that's reflected in their numbers. It's not the most common breed in the UK, but it's not unusual to come across them. And with this particular dog, she was very nice, a female. I'm going to have to refer to her age. She was 9 years of age, and this couple owned the dog from the age of 6 months. What the issue was primarily was a case of separation anxiety. Now, separation anxiety is a simplistic term and it's a bit of a catch-all phrase. But what their dog was doing was not settling at night, which was a fairly recent behaviour. Obviously at 9 years of age, the dog is mature and they know the dog well. And so it's a little bit unusual for a dog of 9 years of age to start showing a behaviour. But we were able, when we were sort of talking more about the situation and how it had come about, is that it probably, the dog's unsettled behaviour at night seemed to be triggered by the Christmas break, and that most likely in turn meant that the owners were spending a lot more time with the dog, as many of us do over our Christmas breaks. So we could probably identify that as being the trigger. But then when I spent time with them, a good 3 hours on that visit, I was able to identify certain behaviours in the dog and of course in the owners that indicated that there was a degree of what we might call over-bonding. Is it possible to over-bond with a dog? Well, the answer is yes. We are of course looking to develop a dog where it can cope to be left alone, either for short periods in the day and or of course at night time. And many dogs don't sleep with owners. The majority don't, I would say, in my experience. And without going down that road particularly, in the sense of, you know, dogs sleeping with owners, because that could be a distraction for me, is that, and we could discuss that on another time actually, it would be an interesting area to discuss on video, because I'm not against it in principle. But of course this dog was struggling being left alone at night, and this was a particularly good case to illustrate this idea about what you might call contrast. So the dog's ability to suck up the owner's presence and warmth and comfort during the day, and in particular in the evening when they were settling down together, and then deciding it's time for bed and putting a dog in a cooler room detached from the owners, that for some dogs can be a challenge. Now, we would normally train a dog to learn to be alone for short periods initially, and then we extend it in keeping with the dog's maturing, assuming we would have a dog from a young age. So this was an interesting situation, but I find that cases of separation anxiety, let's call this like a point of the dog's behaviour where it becomes difficult for the owners to cope with, because of course what was happening is that the dog was being vocal in the night and it was waking the owners up and potentially neighbours as well. And so we have this issue here where if we draw this line and call this a point where we can't tolerate that behaviour, and as I was just saying, being woken at night is for many intolerable, especially over an extended period. But what can happen is that the separation issue can sort of creep up, and there's no real signs of it here. But something like, going back to my earlier point about something like a Christmas period, could then trigger that behaviour, so it becomes more evident to the owners because of the dog's behaviour at night. So what did we do? I mean, separation anxiety is an emotional aspect of a dog's behaviour. I actually like dealing with separation anxiety because we can do a bit of detective work, get to the bottom of what the dog is finding difficult. And if we can pinpoint those aspects, which I believe we were able to do, then we can say, right, well, let's make adjustments there for a period of time. Normally in between my 2 visits, we could be looking at 4 or 6 weeks, let's say. So in that sense, we're looking to create a change in the dog setup in that period so that we can reduce the attachment on the owner. That's probably a good way of putting it. And how can we go about doing that? Well, what we're not looking to do, just for the record, is to give the dog any sense of being, feelings of negativity around the owners, or the dog feeling as though it's been discarded by the owners in some respects. So what we're looking to do is to do enough to allow that behaviour to subside and the dog to rest in the evenings. But of course, if we don't do enough, what can happen is that the behaviour persists and the owners gradually will become more and more exhausted and desperate to resolve the situation. So to give you an idea, I certainly recommended that the dog was provided with its own bed on the floor, a really nice little comfortable bed. This is not an exercise in giving the dog a sense of a hard time on the floor. We can give it the best bed and to give it the most warm environment. But that's something I'll be asking them to do in the very short term. Now, it was an interesting visit physically because when I was there, the dog was repeatedly jumping up on them on the sofa, but it wasn't seeking permission. And so it took about, I didn't count, but there must have been a good 20 moments where the dog jumped up, the owners leant forward, lifted the dog, placed it on the floor. And so we saw about 20 of those before the dog thought, this isn't working. Now, what we're doing at this stage is looking at the dog's temperament and its reaction to these responses to the dog jumping up constantly. The dog, thankfully, was able to settle very quickly on some bedding on the floor, and I'll drop in some images of that here. Now, as you can see, the dog was sitting in the sun, looking very happy and relaxed, and I was coaching the owners to just ignore the dog, look away a little bit, not to worry about the dog. When we're looking at the dog, it can feed a little loop of anxiety. Disconnecting with that, knowing when to do it, and obviously that's where all the time and the one-to-one coaching comes in. But learning how to do that and when to do it does enable a dog to feel, well, it doesn't have to be on the owner before it can relax. And then potentially you can see a connection as to why the dog isn't or wasn't settling at nights. Okay, so by getting the dog to relax on the floor, to be more relaxed in the process and not having to be physically on the owner as well, that was stage 1. We looked at, I have some notes here, so forgive me if I refer to those. So I have a copy of the notes I sent the customer. So we talked about that access to the owners during the day. We also talked about throughout the day, little interactions where we're not sort of gushing over the dog as we enter a room. Okay, learning to be very calm and relaxed around the dog rather than entering into a room and going, hey, how you doing, and touching and looking and all that constant stuff. It keeps the dog emotionally up here when really we want the dog just to chill out and go and relax on its own bed. If we can inject a lot more of that, that's far more conducive to a dog being able to cope at night physically away from the owner. Okay, so that's a key element. We then went on and looked at how the dog is getting physical and mental outlets in the day. When we live with a single dog, it's quite easy to give a dog, especially if a dog is food motivated, which I find the vast majority of them are, but it's relatively easy then for us to say, well, we have a dog that loves its food, which was the case. we don't have any other dogs around, so there's no competition for food. So rather than to feed the dog free of charge on the floor twice a day in a bowl, which is how I feed my dog, so there's no problem with that. But when we're looking for a specific outcome, we can think, well, how could I use that food for the dog to use its brain and some physicality to get that food? I know with my own little dog, Ruby, if I give her meal on the floor in her bowl, which is what happens invariably, it only takes her a minute to finish it, if that. But if I was to redirect that food, if it's a soft food which she is fed, into say a Kong, or if it was some dried food, I could put that into like a hard device and she pushes it around and works for it gradually. That I can get about 30 to 40 minutes of activity out of her for doing that, and by the time she's finished, she's normally actually a little bit out of breath. She's looking for her water afterwards, and normally quite soon afterwards that allows her to settle. So we were able to discuss what they feed their dog and how we could, because it varies from case to case, and how they could use that food specifically to get the dog to work for its food rather than to have it free of charge. Because what we're looking to do, or we could sort of see it as a dual aspect, is that one, we're looking to sensibly drain the dog's mental energy, and also we're looking to drain the dog to a sensible level, taking into account the breed and the age and everything else. We're looking to drain the dog on a sensible level of its physical energy as well. So we were able to identify a number of ways in which we could use food in the day for the dog to use its brain, to drain the mental aspect. And then we also spent some time talking about how we could give the dog more physical outlets as well. Now, traditionally, the dog was given about a 45-minute walk around the block on a little extendable lead, and you can imagine with a small dog how that would come about. And so I'm not critical of it, but what we were able to identify is that the dog could be getting out into wider green spaces on a more regular basis, where the dog could then be placed on a long training line. About 30 foot is right for a small dog of this breed, so we've got connection. Because as you might imagine, a recall and total control of that dog off lead hasn't really been encouraged or trained in, which is fair enough, it happens. So what we were looking at is taking the dog 3 or 4 times a week out into green open spaces where we can put a line on the dog and let it be more dog more of the time, so it can do sniffing, peeing, pooping, you know, bit of play and interaction with the owners. And incidentally, that sort of reduction of attention that I was referring to in the home, well, that doesn't apply when we're out of the home. We can engage with our dog. We're not making up for lost attention in the home when outside, but I do always say, look, just interact with your dog freely. Have plenty of sort of play type interactions, whether that's a bit of food or a bit of a toy, or just you running around getting the dog to chase you. That's all good with me. And there we see we have that more physical draining as well. So when we get those two things addressed in a dog that isn't settling at night, and as I didn't go into detail in the beginning, but remember there are lots of different levels of separation anxiety. Right from, let's say, just to cover them, from a dog that looks a little bit lost when you go out of the house and just waits for you at the front door. Let's call that level 1, all the way up to a level 10 behaviour, whereby the dog is getting very distressed in your absence. Could be barking, howling, damaging, being destructive. It could be peeing or pooing in the house. It could be doing all sorts. You know, I've seen dogs effectively eat their way through a door to get out of a small space when the owner was absent. So there you go, just a quick sort of example of the very worst example of separation anxiety and the least worst. This dog was, in our discussion, I suggested that it was below a 5 and probably about a 3 or a 4. But of course, when that behaviour was manifesting, which was at night through barking and calling the owners back, you know, that's still quite serious, because it affects the owner, and when owners are not getting enough sleep, that in itself is serious as well. If you think about it, the dog with that behaviour can bark all night and then sleep it off in the day. Whereas very often the owners have to be up the next day, active, working, engaging with people, trying to get things done. So we can often see the problem there. Okay. So we have this physical and mental expenditure, and when we get on top of that, then we can really expect and hope that a dog is much more aligned and ready for sleep and rest at night, whilst taking into account that the dog is learning to accept more and more of the time that the dog doesn't have to physically be on the owner for it to be able to rest. So quite simple. I wanted to talk about simplicity, or at least use that word in this video, because keeping things simple, non-complicated, straightforward is really important. It's important for the dog, it's important for the owner. Okay, and I tend to look at things in a relatively straightforward fashion without getting complicated. Dog behaviour and dog behaviour cases are rarely a case of employing academic learning. It's really a case of employing experience, finding ways in which the dog can become as settled as quickly as possible. Okay, because very often when I'm working with people with these sorts of behaviours, they want it resolved as quickly as possible. We can't always rush things, of course. I mean, rarely can we rush things, but equally we can get to the point of what really needs to be done often quite quickly and see changes within a few days. Naturally, I've yet to hear back from this couple, but I am confident that when they apply all of these things, that it will align the dog much better to rest at night. As I discussed and described with the owners, we can often see the issues like I'm giving you here in terms of measures that we're applying as like simple levers, and maybe just 4 or 5 of them in front of us. Some we need to give more, some we might need to give a little bit less. But if we keep those levers and the understanding of what they represent quite simple and straightforward, very often we can move towards a solution in good time. So I think that's the points I'd like to make there. There's a lot of extra detail that I went into with the owners. The dog was also waking them up early, about an hour earlier than they would like to be woken. And of course, what the pattern was for life, throughout this dog's life, was it would wake up early, it would then start to bark, and that would then bring the owners down. So we've talked about that as well, starting to put control back in the hands of the owner so that the dog isn't demanding and controlling, so to speak, so much, and that the owners are expressing more control in the process. So it's a case of when we bring all of these things together over, especially in the short term, because that relates to the period in between my 2 visits, usually a month or so. And then when I go back, we'll be listening to the progress, we'll be recognising what's going well, but most importantly, keep drilling down on what is still a bit of an issue. Okay, and if we do that, again, back to that sort of simplistic approach, that usually the outcome is very positive. So I wanted to share those points with you on this case about separation anxiety, because that could be relating to you as well. Now, the points I've presented here actually can often be implemented without any negative effects. Okay, and so you may well be able to take some of the ideas that I've offered you here and apply them to your own situation, and to see what sort of impact you're seeing in your dog if it has separation anxiety. I think certainly for cases that are moderate, use the points that I'm suggesting. If you believe that your dog has a serious case of separation anxiety, then I would recommend that you contact me directly, and we can discuss your dog's little nuances, and we can give you point you in the direction appropriately at that time. Okay, so thank you once again for watching. Keep your eyes peeled for my next video. I'm trying to upload on a more regular basis to show you guys a number of techniques which I use on a common basis. And I would like to do more videos like this where I'm talking to you in a relatively simple, clean, straightforward way about the type of work I'm seeing on a pet level, in people's homes. This is important. I have had a look through YouTube, not in great detail, but I fail to really see anybody talking about real life cases that are coming up on a regular basis. Of course, I understand why, because it's entertainment, but a lot of the dog content on YouTube or social media is less about really helping us pet owners on a day-to-day basis and seems to be much more sort of dramatic, clickbaity type headings and behaviours in dogs. You know, if invariably you might see a Malinois creeping in or something like that. And I've nothing against them. I see Malinois myself. I see big dogs as well as small dogs. Please don't think I specialise in small dogs. It just happens to be the dog that's coming up next, okay? And so the behaviour and the breeds and then the owners as well, you imagine the amount of variability that I see in the work. Anyway, I love all of that and I just want to share it with you. So thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.